The last few days we have been looking at making a couple of very simple small axes with punched eyes, and I didn't really talk too much about drifts. We've talked about drifts and drifting with regards to hammers in the past, so I didn't really address it too much with this, but there have been a lot of questions about what my exact dimensions are on the drift that I was using. That's a hard question to answer. I can tell you what the dimensions on that drift is, but it's not really that simple. I probably have 20 or 30 different drifts that suit various axe or adze styles that I have made, or things that I have simply come across that would be perfectly suitable drifts. So there isn't a magical formula for a drift unless you're using a store-bought handle. If you're using a store-bought handle, you're going to go to the hardware store, the home center, you're going to buy it online. These usually have kind of a standard that also fits the eyes on most commercially made axes. They are all made to go together, and just about any manufacturer of axe handle is going to have a handle that fits the common axes that are made by manufacturers. Now, this is a big felling axe handle, so that's too big for the axes that we were making. But this little 14-inch, scout hatchet handle, or boy's axe handle, sometimes they call it. You get some confusing terms, but a 14-inch hatchet handle, pretty much the eyes are all the same. So the eye on this handle is 1 3/4 front to back, and about 5/8 of an inch thick. And that is going to vary slightly manufacturer to manufacturer, but if you are making an axe and you want to buy a handle, go buy the handle first. Buy the handle, measure the eye, and then you've got a pattern for, you can see what the curves are and how much teardrop there is, where's the fat spot, where's the thin spot. Make your drift to match the handle. Now, I have all sorts of drifts. Which drift were we were using this one the other day. And this isn't quite that same size. This one's a little under 1.5 inches, so it's a little bit shorter. But it's 5/8 thick, so it's very similar in thickness. This is just a quick look at a very few drifts. This is the one we used the other day for the finished eye on both hatchets. You can see that that fits nicely, and that will work for this handle. This handle doesn't quite fit, but it won't be hard to make it fit. It'll be a fairly easy thing to adapt and get it to fit properly. And that's all done by working the handle, not the axe. This big drift will do the same thing. It starts off very small for a small hatchet and ends up much bigger for a larger felling axe. And this big drift is even a little bit bigger. Now, this drift is made of Atlantic 33, or Flutagon is what they call it, and it was made by Brent Bailey. And I will link to Brent Bailey's YouTube. He doesn't do a lot of videos, but he makes some awesome tools, and this is a great axe drift, and it'll do the big felling axes. I like the longer drifts because I can hold on to this and work the eye under the power hammer when I'm drawing out ears or something like that, and it is much better than trying to hold it in tongs with a drift in. But the truth is, you probably are not going to want to hand make a drift this big. That's a lot of work even under a power hammer. So what you're really looking to make, if you're just starting making axes, is just a little drift that's just big enough to get in the eye. And that one's close, but it's not quite the same eye. And I've got all sorts of little drifts. For these axes, this drift would have been just fine. It's probably made out of an old piece of leaf spring or something. Like I said the other day, I do use junkyard steels, even though I know it's not always the best practice. And all of my drifts for axes are made out of tool steel of one form or another. S7, 4140, old leaf springs, old coil springs, sucker rod, things like that. They hold up much better and they will last much longer if you make them out of good steel. If you're just going to make 1 or 2 axes, mild steel will be just fine. Now these drifts here, this is a set that actually you can buy on eBay. They are cast, but they are cast ductile iron, not just hard cast iron, so they're good durable drift. You can do a whole lot of work with them. And I think there's a fourth one. These two are actually hammer eye drifts. This is a Tomahawk Drift, and I think he makes a smaller Tomahawk or trade axe drift. I don't know who that is. You just have to go search eBay for axe eye drift and see what you find, but they are available out there and they're not bad, reasonably priced, and I don't know if you can get it shipped outside the US or not. You'd have to look. You'll notice that most of these drifts are tapered. That means that the small end will fit a smaller axe and the large end fits a larger axe. That's not always the case. Some of these are near parallel and they're only going to do one size axe, but they're easy enough to make in the small sizes that it's not that big a deal. You can get by to a certain extent making the same eye size for different weight axes, as long as it's not ridiculous. You know, if you're making a 3-pound axe, don't make an eye this small, nor if you're making a 1-pound axe, should you make an eye this big. But there is some crossover there, so you can use the same drift for an axe that's a pound to a pound and a half quite easily, maybe even 2 pounds. So let's go make a drift. I'm going to use some of the sucker rod we got from Larry Roderick. This rod that I'm going to start with is 7/8 diameter. Hopefully that will make a drift that will suit this purpose. Like I say, this is 1 3/4 by 5/8 to, there we go, by about 5/8. And that's what I'm going to want at the thick end of this. And I'm going to make a short little drift, something we can do by hand at the anvil. Making a drift this big, you can do it by hand at the anvil, but I'm not going to. That's why I own a power hammer. And if we're going to make one of these for a video, we're going to do it under the power hammer. Now for a drift, the width and the thickness that I want, this rod probably isn't going to make it. So the first thing I want to do is upset the end some and try and get some mass in there. Actually starting with a piece of material that is the maximum size you want your drift so that you can draw the rest out would be better. So buying a new piece of steel, 4140, 5160, something like that, that you can get in an appropriate flat stock size would be wonderful. The advantage of the round is that we want a rounded profile in the back of our eye, and therefore this round bar, as we flatten it, is going to naturally leave a rounded profile on the edges. And that way we get our rounded back. So there's a little bit of give and take there. Even starting with a bigger round would probably be easier, but I've got lots of this size, so that's what I'm going to use. So let's start by upsetting. The gas forge puts a pretty long heat on a bar, but that's okay because that'll give us a nice long tapered upset as long as we keep it straight. Now this is not very ergonomic. I have this block down here that isn't really an upsetting block, but it works very well for one. But trying to upset this like this would just drive you nuts. It's not very efficient and it's hard on your wrist. I mentioned that this block really isn't meant to be an upsetting block, but it works just fine. It's got a nice heavy, 1.5 inch thick 4130 top on it. I think I may have given you a brief glimpse of this tool the other day. This is just a bottom support that gives you a place for the ears in an axe to go for bigger axes, and has a place then that the drift goes. So this is the whole purpose for this block when making axes and adzes. It gives me a good place to drift through. Some of my drifts are too big for the hardy hole, and I can't drift over the hardy hole. And my swedge block is a little inconvenient, although it's not bad for this purpose. But this is really quite handy. It's not something I would recommend for most people because it's also in the way sometimes. And it's set in the ground just like my anvil is, so it's not movable. My plan is to make a lot more inserts for a lot more different style of axes and various things that I need to drift. For instance, my froze have an 1 3/4 diameter eye, and I can't drift that over my hardy hole. So just having an 1 3/4 hole on a plate there that's about this high, and that's a much better striking height to strike your drift. So it's all about ergonomics is what that block is. Ultimately, I want the top of the drift to be a little beveled, so I got something to strike with a hammer that won't mushroom so easily. So I'm going to start doing that now, and then I'm going to do just a little bit more upsetting, although we're close to what I want. And so we don't have to keep moving the camera, I'll go back to doing it this way. So the very top of this, we're now at about 1 1/8 inches, so we've added about 1/4 inch. I'm going to go just a few more heats and see if I can get that to 1 1/4 inches or slightly better. Remember to try and keep it straight so your energy is going to the upset and not to the bending. Also helps to turn it in circles as you go here. We're getting very close there. One more and I think we'll call it good for now. I'm going to get away from this heavy hammer here in a minute too. Okay, we're right at 1 1/4 inches, so I'm going to try that. If it doesn't work, we can always upset it a little bit more later. Now for a drift to work, it needs to go most of the way through the eye, ideally all the way through the eye. But on a hammer or most axes, you're only acting on the top half because you're creating an hourglass shape, and I'll explain that a little bit more. So if I had a 2-inch drift, it would probably work, but it's harder to manipulate. Too long a drift is a lot of extra work we don't need to go through, so I'm going to aim for about a 5-inch drift, which is the width of my anvil. If it's a little longer, a little shorter, that's okay. I'm just going to start tapering the bar. And because this is my fat spot, I'm starting on my near edge of the anvil, and my hammer is right over the edge, so I'm kind of creating a shoulder in what will be the bar that I leave. This is where I will cut it later. Let's see if this camera angle looks any better. I also know that at the very end I'm going to have to taper it in both directions just to get it started in the eye. This stuff is tough, so I'm going to have to heat it back up again, but there you can kind of see what I'm starting with. Now I don't want to work the back too much. There's just that little bit right here at the edge that I want to do, but I want that to stay rounded on that side. There will be a fair amount of filing and grinding or whatever it is you've got to shape when this is all done, unless you just get really lucky. So I've widened out to 1 3/8, and I'm still a little over 3/4 of an inch thick. So I can draw this out more in here. I'm going to do very little here at this point. And I think that's a good time to switch to a lighter hammer. This end I want to take down to about 1/4 of an inch, I think, so I can get it into that slit or punched eye. And because I'm working in both directions, I need to round that back up a little bit here. It's starting to look like a drift. If you don't taper it into the teardrop, you're making a hammer eye drift. Now certainly having some kind of a swedge that matches the shape of your drift would be easy, but it'd take more time to make the swedge than it does to make the drift without the swedge. So unless you're making drifts all the time and selling them, I see no point in making a swedge. Now as I get close with this, I'm going to pick a side that's going to be my tapered side, and I'm going to start tapering that to a point for my teardrop. And then I'll refine the profile a little bit more to make sure that it's what I want, because it's going to spread out and my profile will change. But I'm working with angled hammer blows and not working the fat spot. I don't want to make that any thinner than it is. Now as you thin this edge, this drift kicks over backwards, so you'll have to straighten it. You can pre-bend a little bit, but you'll still have to straighten it. We're now at about 1.5 inches across, still 3/4 inch thick, though I think I'll upset this back down a little bit and try to straighten it in the next heat. But we aren't at a point yet, so we want to keep going till we get to a point. Now there is no doubt that this would be easier in mild steel. But this will be a lifelong tool. Just keep repeating all the same steps until you're happy with it. Unfortunately, my nice round back edge does suffer some throughout all this, so there is some need to try and round that back up some. I don't use the peen too much drawing this out sideways because I want to stay away from any deep peen marks. But it's hard to get that edge right down to a near point. You don't actually want it sharp. You're not trying to create a chisel edge there. But you want it to be about an 1/8 inch radius. Boy, we're getting close. Trying to do as much of this by forging as I can, just to keep the drift as large as I can. There is a point where going to the grinder makes sense though. One thing that I'm not liking is that this is kicked back and I've got a little fat spot here or a thin spot here, and I would like to get that straightened out. It's not the end of the world, but it means I got to grind that off to keep this straight. And since I'm just now at 1 3/4 inches, I would lose about 1/8 of an inch on my overall width if I do that. Now you notice this drift is fairly parallel through here, and I want it parallel front to back. I want most of my taper side to side to create a nice hourglass eye shape. But it doesn't need an hourglass front to back. I think we are pretty much there. I'm just kind of light planishing blows. This isn't really forging at this point, it's just smoothing. Then I think we're going to take it to the vise and do a little hot rasping. Typically I would take it to the grinder and just grind it. It would be fast and very simple. But we're going to assume you may not have a grinder, so we'll do some hot rasping. This is where leaving it on the handle really pays off. For most of this, I'm using the smoother side of the rasp. Then we're going to turn it around to the other side. So with this facing the other direction, we'll work the other side. Hot rasping can be a bit of a workout. I'm going to take 2 more heats to rasp. You might notice that this is a little wavy here, so I want to clean that edge up some. It's also a little bit sharper than it needs to be, so I'll dull it back some. And then I want to make sure the back is rounded up. I think I've got enough heat to finish this back side. That's the majority of this done. We're going to cut it off, and then we're going to clean up this end where I've been attached to the bar. Well, I just cut that off over the Hardy and completely forgot to turn the camera on. Sorry about that. I just want to taper this end so that it will go into the axe eye in its rough stage a little bit easier. And that'll need a little bit of grinding or filing as well. Especially get rid of that burr from the Hardy. So except for that final filing or grinding, this is a finished drift. And currently it is right at 5 inches long. Looks like we ended up about 1 5/8 inches wide, which will be okay. And we're about 3/4 of an inch thick. So that's a pretty good drift. Like all tools that are made out of hardenable steel, this should be annealed at this point, not just normalized, brought back up to heat slowly, not overheated, just the exact right heat to anneal it, bury it in vermiculite, or some other way to slow cool it. Normalizing is your next best bet, but it's not as good as annealing. In the interest of getting this video done in a single day, I did just what I told you not to do, and I went ahead and just normalized this and let it air cool instead of doing a proper annealing cycle. Before I use it, I will go back and anneal it, and then I will do some form of heat treat, which I will discuss here briefly. But this isn't a bad little drift. Now, because this is made out of sucker rod, this is a good tough steel. It's going to last a lot longer than a mild steel drift would. It ended up, after a little polishing on the grinder, and I just took it to a 220 to make it smoother, We are 1 5/8 at the top, about 5/8 wide this way, so it's a little bit smaller than I set out for, but it is still plenty adequate for these small axes. It goes in about halfway there. For a larger axe, it would go in just a little bit further, but it's very similar in size and shape to our commercial axe handle. And if you're making your own axe handles, it really doesn't matter because you make them to fit the eye after the axe is done instead of making the eye to fit the store-bought axe handle. Just depends on which route you want to go. You can probably get by with an as-forged finish on a drift if you are very good and very smooth, very shallow hammer marks. The smoother it is, the better though, so if you take the time to hot rasp and then maybe to file it afterwards, although this is hard to hold in a vise now to file, it's a very awkward thing to get a good grip on, which is why going to the belt grinder works so well for me. And yes, that's what I did with this. And I did a 60 grit, cleaned it up, went to 220, took the 60 grit marks out. But the smoother this is, the better it's going to behave for you, because as you drift your axe, the drift is fairly cold, probably too hot to hold on to, but way colder than the axe eye. The axe eye is going to start cooling and shrinking around the drift. And the rougher the drift is, the harder it's going to be to drive as you're working, but also the harder it's going to be to get back out when you're done. So if it's a nice, smooth, clean drift, it's going to behave a lot better and it'd be less frustrating to use. Now, as far as heat treating a drift goes, the sucker rod is pretty tough stuff. It's 4140, 4130, something in that range. And I will put a link to the sucker rod chart that I've referred to. But you have to find the number on that knuckle. If you've just got a straight section of rod and you don't have the knuckle, you're guessing. But it's tough enough steel and doesn't want to deform and move too easily. You can probably get by without any real heat treat. I would still anneal it to take any forging stress out. And then I would bring it back up to heat after annealing and just let it air cool. That's not really a hardening cycle, that's more of a normalizing cycle, but it will be tougher or a little bit harder after air cooling than it is after normalizing, because normalizing doesn't de-stress it as much as annealing does. We're going to have to talk about those terms some in a separate video, I think. But if you just air cool it, and it really, if I just used it like this, it's probably fine, but taking the time to anneal it helps guarantee that it won't crack. Typically, I will go ahead and harden and temper a drift. The sucker rod's almost always oil quench. And if I do that, harden it, temper it, and I temper it way back. I don't temper it at 400 or something like that. I'm going to take it up a lot hotter than that. It's going to be a longer lasting tool. It's going to behave better. It's going to stand up to the hammer blows. But every time you use it, you're tempering it more and more. You're going to add a lot more temper. This thing might actually start to glow a little bit, in which case you've really tempered it to the point that it's almost soft steel again, but not quite. The only way to get it back to truly being soft and softer than it is after hardening and tempering is to re-anneal it. And if you don't re-anneal it, if you don't get it that hot and put it in the vermiculite, even though it showed a little glow, it's still harder than it would have been if you didn't do the hardening step. It's negligible. It probably doesn't matter that much, and I wouldn't go out of my way to do it if you're just making the occasional axe or hammer, if it's a hammerite drift. But for one you're going to use 40 or 50 times a year, it may be worth taking that step. And in that case, it may be worth buying new steel that you know what it is and making it out of known 4140, known 5160, or even S7. My big drifts, I like S7, but I also use them under the power hammer, and it survives that a lot better. Well, there's enough talking about drifts, hardening, and tempering. The other thing I want to talk about just real briefly is the shape. I've left it fairly parallel this way, and that's because your eye on the axe doesn't really need to be tapered front to back. Your axe handles aren't tapered front to back, and when you wedge them, they don't really wedge front to back. They wedge side to side. So you need a taper side to side, and that's what we've made, is a side to side taper. And if you work it both ways, you end up with kind of an hourglass in there. And we talked about this when we did hammers. And by getting that hourglass shape in here, that means the handle slides in a little bit easier because it's tapered on the bottom. But then when you put the wedge in the top, the wedge spreads out and it can't come out of that top taper. And that's what holds the handle in. So you need that taper in the drift to do that. You don't really need it front to back. In fact, it can be a problem if you've got a great big wide eye here. It's hard to wedge a handle that direction and fill that up. So, that's all of that. I hope that was useful. I hope that answers the questions of the people that wanted to know what the dimensions of my drifts were. They're all different. Some of them I found. Some of them I've made. Some of them were bought and made by other people. It just depends, and if you've got a drift that works, you use it and you make a handle to fit or hope it's pretty close to the store-bought handle. If it's got to fit something specific, make one to fit the job you're doing. The size isn't magical. But again, this one is about 1 5/8 inches at its widest point, about 5/8 thick at its widest point, and 5 inches long. That's just what I made today. I've made shorter ones, I've made longer ones. There's not a specific formula. Buy the handle, make the drift match the handle, or make the drift match what you see in your mind and you want your drift to be, and then make a handle yourself to match the eye that you forged in your axe. Anyways, I've talked long enough. Give it a thumbs up if I didn't bore you too much. Love it if you hit that subscribe button. Take some time, watch a few of the other videos, share the videos with your friends, but absolutely get out to the shop, make something, make some of your own tooling, make a project using that tooling, challenge your imagination, but stay safe and do wear your safety glasses. We'll see you around for the next one.